So we want to say thanks this morning to, in addition to Deb Schneider, the Congregational Care Committee and Mary Beck, who have provided our refreshments for the day. And if you would like to help out with that, please be in touch with Deborah. She'll be working to provide those refreshments for the next, for the duration of the series. Let's begin with a prayer. Let us pray. God of all peoples and nations and languages, at the Tower of Babel you confused human speech so we would learn to depend on you. And on the day of Pentecost you made the good news intelligible to people in their own native languages. In your great wisdom you still speak to us today, not in words that we can wield for our own glory, but in words that reveal the mystery of your grace on which our lives depend. As we explore the mystery of your word and the human words through which it comes to us, give us ears to hear and hearts to receive the good news of life in the Word made flesh, Jesus Christ our Lord. We thank you for the words brought to us today by Brian Bibb, and ask your blessing on him as he speaks and us as we listen, that we would receive this good news and be strengthened through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. It's my pleasure to welcome once again our lecturer, professor of religion at Furman University, member of First Presbyterian Church in Greer and an elder there, and our lecturer, Brian Bibb.
Am I on? All right. Well, all of my technology working in concert. Perfect. So it's again a real pleasure to be with you this morning in our series on the theology of Bible translation. We're completing today, and some of you will be sad, some may be happy to hear that we're completing our historical survey of the Bible in English before we launch next week into more particular interpretive issues. I must say I was really encouraged last week by your energy and enthusiasm and curiosity in dealing with some pretty difficult questions and difficult issues. And as I said before, my intention here is not to cover every bit of evidence or every issue, but rather to help us think about how we should think about the issues and how we should think about the evidence in these questions. In our first session, we surveyed some of the most important aspects of the development of the biblical text in Hebrew and Greek. We looked at the complex history of early textual practices, the Bible's oral traditions, the scribes that copied and preserved and transmitted and edited and canonized the Bible both in their Old and New Testament forms. So where we ended was in the early modern period, 2 centuries after the Reformation, with the development of modern textual criticism in the new field of academic biblical studies. So scholars who began to pull these Greek and Hebrew texts together in very critical, analytical ways, creating new critical editions of the biblical text for scholars and for translators, which led eventually to new translations. And what we've seen in the past 50 years or so is a blossoming, or maybe an explosion, vomiting of new Bible translations, and indeed increased polarization around the question of biblical language. So what we have seen is that translation is born in the context of political and religious controversy. We have seen how it has been connected with political and religious controversy ever since. And we're going to see that Bible translation reflects and contributes to division among the Bible reading community. So we're continuing our discussion from the development of the Hebrew and Greek text into the development of the English text, but they're all the same methodological issues about understanding the biblical text as embedded in particular human textual practices is all the same. It's just we're in a language that we happily can read much easier than the other ones. So last week I described how Jerome translated the Hebrew and Greek texts of the Bible into Latin, creating his Bible version, which was called the Vulgate, which after a time was the standard Bible for the Roman Catholic Church for the better part of 1,000 years. That's pretty good work for a scholar. It was the basis of church teaching and church practice and doctrines. For all practical purposes, for the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, the Vulgate was the Bible. It was the final textual authority against which all doctrinal and practical theological issues were measured. So beginning in, however, the 14th and 15th centuries, dissidents began to oppose core aspects of the Church's teaching and practice. This is something that we call the Reformation. And naturally, these reforming figures interpreted the Bible in ways that matched their own particular theological claims and theological views. So notice, then, the particular powerful shift in thinking that takes place here in the 14th into the 15th centuries. Instead of seeing the church as the highest authority in matters of faith and truth, the reformers began to see that there was a higher authority, a higher theological authority against which the church can be judged and held accountable. Now, there were dissidents throughout the history of the church. And even in the midst of the Reformation, there were scholars and leaders who were pushing for reform but still remained loyal to the church. So I don't want to create an overly romantic view of the Reformation. That's very common in churches that are called Presbyterian churches. However, my point is that the Reformation that era did create a new ideological space for the Bible, separate from the church's hierarchy, separate from the church's authority. It's that ideological space that creates the room for new translations into all these languages, and incidentally, creates the space for critical scholars to study the Bible in a non-religious context, and ultimately leads to me having a tenured position. So we're happy for these things. Last week, we saw how the biblical text does not and has not ever existed in a disembodied ether, an idealized form. It's always a document, a text, produced and handled and published and interpreted by people. So we're going to trace this development, starting in the Reformation, up to the very cusp of the modern period, in order to illustrate the new role that the Bible began to play in the ideological context of the Western Church. So we're going to look at the earliest reformers who are associated with the English Bible translation. This happy young man is named John Wycliffe. Maybe you've heard of him. In the 14th century, there began to appear for the first time English translations of the biblical text as a whole. There had been devotional texts and other kinds of poetic texts that translated particular passages in Middle English. But we start to see now in the end of the 14th century modern English translations of biblical texts for the first time. The most influential early version was an English translation of the Latin Vulgate itself that appeared in two revisions, 1382 and 1388. And in the years after his death was attributed to this man, John Wycliffe. Even though he did not do any of the actual translation, and it is possible, scholars disagree on this point, that he had little or nothing to do with it. Wycliffe became known as the morning star of the Reformation, in large part because of his theological writings, especially his 1378 pamphlet called Concerning the Authority of the Pope. And you can probably anticipate what he argues in that, which is that the Bible stands over and above all human church authorities when it comes to judging Christian doctrine. It also will not surprise you to hear that his teachings were declared heretical in 1382. He went into seclusion and died of a stroke in 1384. Still writing prodigiously. Historians have generally believed that two of his associates, fellows named John Purvey and Nicholas of Hereford, are the ones who translated the Vulgate into English, directed by, inspired by, adjacent with Wycliffe's own reforming efforts. Bruce Metzger, who I've mentioned before, writes that although Wycliffe did not take part in the work, he says we can refer to it as the Wycliffite Bible, for it was under his inspiration that the work was done. Published, as I said, in 2 editions, 1382 and 1388. There's some fascinating changes in between them. It was condemned as heresy in 1415, so years after Wycliffe had died, because of its widespread use among a reforming group in England called the Lollards. They were lay preachers.
Sorry.
That's okay. Oh, it's okay. It is. It's fine. Okay. Should come back. Thank you. So the Lollards were these lay preachers, and they were a challenge to the church authorities in England. They were big on Bible translation, and they liked Wycliffe's version. In 1425, Wycliffe, had been dead for 2 decades, 3 decades. I can't do math. His bones were exhumed, burned, scattered in the river to quell reforming zeal in England, which was not successful. The Wycliffite Bible, as we might call it, circulated with a prologue that may or may not have been original to the text, but it laid out a very interesting 4-step process of translation. First, the translator says that he used copies of the Vulgate and other ancient Latin sources to come up with an accurate text with which to work, a good source text, base text. Second, he says he revised that text in light of commentaries by textual scholars of his own day. Third, he says he consulted ancient grammars and ancient commentaries to discover the best meaning of particular theological terms. And then he says finally that the meaning of each passage was translated as clearly as possible based on the sense of each phrase, not on the meaning of each individual word. So this prologue justifies the new translation of the Vulgate by appealing to the work of Jerome himself. Here is a picture of the of the Wycliffe Bible. If Jerome was translating the Bible into Latin, which was the common language of his day, now that readers in England read English and not Latin, he says, why should not readers now have new vernacular translations that serve the same purpose as Jerome's originally? Now, it's remarkable. This 4-step process in the prologue, 1388 Wycliffe Bible, is basically followed by every major Bible translation since. In the century since Wycliffe's Bible was made, scholars now have a better understanding of how to do each of those steps, the textual work and the interpretive work and the translation work. But the process of establishing and clarifying and interpreting and rendering the plain sense of the text is still the main task of Bible translation, which is not to make it sound simple. For the next century after Wycliffe, the church in England was ruled by a rule called Archbishop Arundel's Constitutions, in which the Archbishop said, we're not going to have any new Bible translations. And you're not allowed to have them or do them or read them. However, there is still evidence that ownership of the Wycliffe Bible was very broad. There's actually a very surprising number of copies still surviving from that early period. There is evidence that ownership of the Wycliffe Bible and the reading of it was very widespread. The next major step forward was the work of William Tyndale, who translated the New Testament from Greek into English. He was the first one to do so between 1523 and 1525. Now, last week we talked about how Erasmus was the scholar who created the critical New Testament from all of the existing Greek manuscripts. And so now Tyndale was able to use an up-to-date modern version of the New Testament for his translation work. He started in England and then promptly had to flee. He went to Germany, where he completed his New Testament. He spent his last years in Antwerp in the Low Countries, modern-day Belgium. In 1535, he was betrayed by his associate and kidnapped, taken to Belgium, to Brussels, imprisoned, where he continued working on an Old Testament translation of Chronicles, tried for heresy, executed by strangling and then burning. Now, consider this. While Tyndale was being tried, like literally while he was imprisoned, His New Testament translation was being widely read and used in England. In fact, even before his death in 1535, Miles Coverdale produced a new version of the Bible that used Tyndale's New Testament, along with his own rendering, very poor rendering of the Old Testament, with the knowledge of, if not the permission of, at least the indifference of, King Henry. So, it's kind of hard to explain, but the point is that the translation of the Bible into English was becoming a settled, normal idea. I think they had started to accommodate themselves to, yes, the Bible will appear in English. But the question is, who's doing it? How much control are they under? And what the king is interested in is control of the narrative, power over the pieces of the process. Tyndale, being a radical, living outside the country, having been associated with the German Reformation, he was bad. But his work itself ended up becoming the most important step forward in English Bible translation. And really, our own understanding of the New Testament is indebted almost completely, I would argue, in its essence, to the work that Tyndale did in 1525. A few different Bible versions. Here's Tyndale. There's Coverdale, and there's his Bible. A few different Bible versions appeared in the years after Coverdale, and they followed the path of using Tyndale as their base text. And like Coverdale, they separated the Apocrypha into its own section. I think we talked about this, how the Reformers took all of these extra non-Hebrew Bible Old Testament books and put them in the extra section, the Apocrypha, and said that these are optional, therefore everybody stopped reading it. These other editions include Matthew's Bible in 1537, produced by a man named John Rogers, who was a friend of Tyndale, and who was eventually burned alive as a Protestant martyr during the reign of Mary in 1555. The Taverner's Bible, which I think is this one. The Taverner's Bible. I lost my place. Here we go. The first Bible to be printed entirely in England. Tyndale and Coverdale and all the others were printed in Antwerp. And also the Great Bible, 1539, which was the first officially authorized Bible. Oh, that's this one, I think. One of these is the Great Bible, which was called the Great Bible because it was so big. It was overseen by Coverdale himself at the behest of Thomas Cromwell. So if you know anything about English history, which is very complicated in this period, there's this constant back and forth between the Catholics and the Protestants and their relative control of things. And so for a while, you have English Protestants being able to openly translate, and then in the next phase, they have to run for their lives. And for a while, the Catholics are okay, then they have to run for their lives. It goes back and forth. When the Bibles were being burned and largely outlawed in 1546, the Great Bible was the only one that remained allowed. And then it could only be owned by people in the upper classes. Bible reading and translation was opened up again during the reign of Edward in 1547. So this back and forth kind of political situation is what I'm interested in. In 1549 and 1551, there appeared a new version of the Bible with expanded notes and commentary done by a fellow named Edmund Beck. Now, this is a tiny footnote in the history of English Bible publishing and translation. But for my work, it's actually really interesting and important. His version included an explanatory note with 1 Peter 3:7, infamous explanatory note. In 1 Peter, the author says that husbands shall dwell with their wives according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife and unto the weaker vessel. So, it's slightly problematic. But the note, this is Beck's note on that text, that the husband taketh her as a necessary helper, and not as a bondservant or a bondslave. And if she be not obedient and helpful unto him, endeavoureth to beat the fear of God into her head, that thereby she may be compelled to learn her duty and to do it. There's the red part here where it says, beat the fear of God into her head. So in the very earliest period, the issue is getting the Bible translated at all. Once it's settled and it's translated, however, the conversation shifts to what form should the text take? What purpose should it serve? Whose interests should it benefit? Clearly, Beck understood the power of this in using the Bible as a platform upon which to establish and promote patriarchal gender politics. And as we go forward next week and the next couple of weeks, we're going to see this process of using the Bible as a platform for particular ideas about social, political issues is generally the way things go. This is only a small example of the ways in which the Bible in English became increasingly embroiled in political and social conflict. The next major event took place with the publication of the Geneva Bible in 1560 in Geneva. English Protestants had fled from Mary and were living in Switzerland. Translators include a guy named William Whittingham, who happened to be John Calvin's brother-in-law. So that was pretty good. The Geneva Bible, very important. It was the first Bible to use Roman type, like clear type, instead of real heavy block type that was hard to read. It was the first Bible to use verse numbers. Now, we're going to talk about this later. I think verse numbers are an abomination of the devil, and have done more to harm Bible reading in the church than almost any other innovation in printing. We'll talk about that. The Geneva Bible was also the first one to include extensive commentary in the margins, maps, charts, outlines, various helps to help the reader. And it's that made the Geneva Bible important ultimately, and also infamous in its own day, not the translation itself. In Exodus 1, there's a very famous passage where the midwives lie to the Pharaoh about how they're unable to kill the Hebrew boys, when he says that the Hebrew boys have to be murdered. And in the note, which is this page, it says down here on the bottom left, I don't think you can read it, but in the note, it says that the midwives were wrong to lie, but correct to disobey the Pharaoh. And that monarchs are known when they are disobeyed to fall into a rage. And, this was not popular among the royal class, who really were worried about this idea that people can go around just disobeying the monarch whenever they want. In 1568, church authorities tried to... There's a map from the Geneva Bible here. It's very cool. In 1568, the church authorities in England tried to take some of the air out of the Geneva Bible by revising their own version and creating the Bishop's Bible based on the Great Bible of 1539. It was a rushed project, and the quality is very uneven. They did a thing where he assigned different people to do the work, but then didn't check it. So there's a lot of unevenness, and it's not a great translation. However, it did become the Bible in England and was the primary reference text for the King James translators when they came along later on. So the point is that this was an effort to make sure that people in England had a Bible they enjoyed and they felt good about, so they weren't tempted to open up that radical, heretical rabble that the Geneva folks had created. Now, before we move on, I should mention a project called the Reims-Douay Bible, which was named for two cities in France where English Catholics during the reign of Elizabeth I had fled, and they translated the Bible between 1582 and 1610. Now, the Reims-Douay Bible is not a translation of the Greek and Hebrew. Remember, I said that for Catholics, the Vulgate was the text. And so this is a translation of the Vulgate into English, of the Latin into English. Because there had been such a precise synergy between the language of the Vulgate and the language of the theology of the church, the Reims-Douay Bible is interesting in that they keep a lot of really complicated technical Latin terminology in the translation. So much so that the editor had to include a glossary at the end of explaining all the various terms that people who didn't read Latin didn't know. Now, keep that in your mind as we go into our own 20th and 21st century context. People get very invested in particular technical terminology in the Bible. Terms like justification, right? Terms like atonement. And when new translations start creating more explanatory versions of justification, people sometimes get a little upset. Like the Geneva Bible, the Reims-Douay Bible had all kinds of marginal notes complaining about theological issues and railing against the heretics. For example, the note in Matthew 6, when Jesus says that one cannot have two masters, The notes say that this refers to two religions, God and Baal, Christ and Calvin, Mass and communion, the Catholic Church and heretical conventicles. So, the two masters, Christ or Calvin. You got to pick. So, this brings us to the incredibly complicated topic of the production of the King James Bible. King James. Just very briefly, I want to focus on three particular aspects of the King James Bible. The political context in which it was authorized, the process that its translators used, and its enduring contribution to the English Bible. My claim, and we're going to test this in the next few weeks, is that the King James Bible is, in fact, the only English Bible translation. And that even now, there is the King James, and then there is everything that either follows the King James or intentionally tries to move away from the King James. Everything either imitates it or intentionally departs from it. I think of it as the sun around which all English Bible translation orbits, even to this day. Now, the origins of the KJV are in the political and religious conflict of the late 16th, early 17th centuries, specifically between the Anglicans and the Puritans. In 1604, the king assembled a group of leaders from both groups to try to talk about toleration. And there was one Puritan named John Reynolds who made a suggestion at that meeting that they create a new translation of the Bible that could be a common text that would be improved from the English translations that were available. At the time, nobody wanted to do it. They did not authorize that. And however, King James himself was taken with the idea and decided, this is what we're going to do. So he directed a group of 50 scholars to break up into 6 different panels. And each of those panels had portions of the Bible assigned to them. 3 in the Old Testament, 2 in the New Testament, and 1 in the Apocrypha. And he said, you've got to create a new translation that follows the bishop's Bible as much as possible. Only depart from it when necessary. And that, and this is crucial, has no explanatory material whatsoever. Except for Hebrew and Greek explanations that are necessary. So he's concerned not about the translation, for example, of the Geneva Bible that the Puritans were using, but he was concerned about the marginal note about the Pharaoh and the midwives. So they began in 1607 and took 3 or 4 years to do this. When one of the 6 groups finished a part, they would send their work to the other panels who would review that and then make suggestions. And then there was an editorial board comprised of the main people from each of those groups who made final decisions about what the wording was going to be. And so they're also, I should say, as with the Wycliffe Forward, that process is basically still the same process followed by all major Bible translations. We're going to see how there were some translations done by individuals working alone, but by and large, almost every major translation of the Bible into English has been accomplished by a committee who has this kind of division of labor with an editorial structure, almost exactly like the one the King James Version translators used. Also, as part of the KJV, was a remarkably delightful and forward-looking translator's preface. Here's the printed version. It was written by a guy named Miles Smith, who is here. Now, in a future session, we're going to talk about the contemporary debate around KJV only. You ever familiar with the KJV only faction? There's a few of these churches in Greenville. My view is that if the King James had continued to be printed with this translator's forward, people would have, in general, a much better understanding of Bible translation. So, let's see here. In many ways, then, I will say that the King James Bible should be understood as the culmination of a long process of English Bible translation. Bruce Metzger wrote this. He said, although it's usually called a translation, The King James Version is in fact merely, I don't think I'd use merely there, merely a revision of the bishop's Bible, as this itself was a revision of the Great Bible, and the Great Bible a revision of Coverdale and Tyndale. A great deal of the praise, therefore, he says, that is given to the KJV belongs to its predecessors. For the idiom and vocabulary, Tyndale deserves the greatest credit. For the melody and harmony, Coverdale. For scholarship and accuracy, the Geneva version. So the King James then did not immediately become the only or even the most important English Bible translation in its own day. In fact, evidence shows that the translators of the KJV themselves, 50 years later, were not using the King James in their own sermons. And it received heavy criticism all the way through the 17th century for various reasons. But eventually, the KJV did become the only English Bible. It was revised regularly in small ways through various printings. And, however, it ruled mostly unchanged over the English language in England and America for centuries. So, I'll stop there for a second. Let me pause there for a second. Any questions about the KJV? I'm getting ready to skip about 250 years. That's it. We're going to make it to about 1923 today. Yes?
Tracing the King James Version's basis backwards,
Mm-hmm.
it comes to the Latin Vulgate. Is that what it comes back to?
No, Hebrew and Greek eventually. So Tyndale's using the Greek. And then eventually, by the time the Matthew's Bible comes out, they're using the Hebrew Old Testament.
And the printing press came out in conjunction with which of these versions?
Before all of them. I mean, this is...
Before Latin Vulgate?
No. The Vulgate eventually was printed, but when Erasmus's New Testament and the Tyndale New Testament, these were made possible for wide distribution because of the printing press. That was, really the most important technological advancement that made all this possible. Good question. Thank you. I should have mentioned the printing press a little more.
What about that introduction you said that helped explain the King James?
Yes.
What's the salient point of that?
They're basically talking about how the idea of word-for-word translation is not possible. That we have to think about the sense of larger phrases and paragraphs, and sometimes the same word in Hebrew needs to be different words in English, or the same word in Greek is different words in English, and basically a much more humble understanding of their own process compared with the kind of triumphalist, very arrogant claims made about the KJV in our modern day by KJV-only people. So when we talk about conflicts in 2 weeks, I'm going to have more.
And who wrote that introduction?
Miles Smith. You can buy copies of it. It's available online. Here's the thing that you should always do, by the way. This is the most overlooked but most interesting part of Bibles are the prologues and the prefaces and the intros. Always read those. Sometimes you have to read them online, but mostly they're vapid and ridiculous. But they give you sometimes here's what they do. It's kind of like when your kids are talking to you and you realize what you're saying doesn't make any sense, but because you're talking to me, I know what you're worried about. That's what we get from these prefaces. So you can see the issues that they're struggling with, even though what they say is usually not very interesting. But the KJV prologue, by contrast, is really great, I think. So the KJV is still the most read Bible in America. But it's no longer the only one. What else happened? Now, starting next week, we're going to start focusing on more specific textual details in Bible translations. We're going to be looking at specific texts and talking about interpretation. But I want to say a few words here about historically, how do we get from the KJV to where we are now? What happened? Now, there were many attempts to revise the KJV and or create something new and modern in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in America. I can't go into all of these. There's some of them very interesting. One notable one was that done by this guy, Noah Webster. He had already achieved his legacy by producing the Webster's Dictionary, the source for every terrible college essay intro paragraph. But then after that, he said what he really wanted to do, what he saw as his life's work, was revising the King James Bible. He took years to do it, and when it came out, it was ultimately a very light revision. Not really interesting changes at all. There were other New Testament translations based on new critical editions of the Greek New Testament, which were made possible. Let's see, there's his version. Oh, no, this is Dickinson. Pause there for a second. So there are New Testament translations that were based on new and up-to-date, cutting-edge Greek manuscripts. One translation done by Abner Neeland, one by Alexander Campbell. And these are versions that foreshadow later conflicts about which Greek text should be used. And if you ever hear people say, that Bible removes verses from the New Testament, that's the root of this. And you start to see this as well in the 19th century. I want to mention as well, I think it's fascinating, but also relevant to where we're sitting. The New Testament published in 1833 by Episcopal minister Rudolphus Dickinson, who served as a rector in Pendleton, South Carolina. I don't have his picture. I have it somewhere, but this is a picture of his, the New Testament, new and corrected version of the New Testament. The Evangelists and the Apostles by Rudolphus Dickinson, Boston, 1833. So Dickinson was from Boston and was assigned down to Pendleton to work in the Episcopal Church in Pendleton. And he got the idea that he wanted to translate the New Testament into good, updated, modern style. Appropriate, he said, quote, for the reading room, saloon, and toilet, as well as for the church, school, and nursery. This is what he wanted to do. That's a laudable goal. Unfortunately, Reverend Dickinson was a terrible translator, and his version is, I think, fair to say, one of the worst Bible versions ever made in America. It received from one contemporary review, quote, a verdict of unqualified condemnation. Here are a couple of examples. He wasn't good with English. Acts 1:18, when Judas dies, it says, and Judas, falling prostrate, a violent internal spasm ensued, and all his viscera were emitted. But if you know the story, Judas falls down and his guts spill out. In Acts 26, this says this, Festus declared with a loud voice, Paul, you are insane. Multiplied research drives you to distraction. Too true. It's too true. Oh, one more. In Matthew 5, Jesus says that a man may not divorce his wife, quote, except in the case of incontinence. I have a great sympathy for Reverend Dickinson. You know, he's in the middle of nowhere. He's in Pendleton in 1833. And he's trying his best. The first woman to translate the Bible into English was Julia Evelina Smith in 1876. She taught herself Greek and Hebrew, translated the Bible in her 50s and 60s. Her work, frankly, astonishing for its day. Smith and her sister published the Bible as part of their effort to show the intellectual capabilities of women. They're also trying to raise money in the midst of a prolonged and unjust property dispute with the town of Glastonbury, Connecticut. Unfortunately, she had a devotion to what she called literal translation, which meant she tried to render every Greek and Hebrew word with only one English equivalent. And she also didn't understand how Hebrew tenses work. And so you get translations like Genesis 1, where instead of God said, let there be light, and there was light, she wrote, and God shall say there will be light, and there will be light. Because in Hebrew, it looks like a future tense verb, but it's not. But she didn't understand that. I will say this. The significance of Smith's translation goes well beyond the text itself. And I think we should say, from our point of view, the scholarly deficiencies of the work are not a reflection on Smith as such, but rather a reflection on the patriarchal time in which he lived and worked. A notable solo project in the early 20th century was that done by Edgar Goodspeed, a professor at the University of Chicago. He did a New Testament and American translation in 1923. And I think he was, in fact, the first one to successfully do what he wanted to do, which was, quote, bring what the writers meant to convey directly and vividly before the American reader, so that it would not be necessary for him to detour through a course in 16th century English. So he was somebody who did understand Greek very well and also was a good writer, and so his New Testament is actually really good. In 1931, Goodspeed's New Testament was paired with a Chicago version of the Old Testament done by J.M. Powys Smith. Oh, that's not it. To create the Bible and American translation. And then in 1939, Goodspeed added an Apocrypha to create the complete Bible and American translation. So this was in the 1920s and 30s. Now, there's a reason why you have never heard, most likely, of Goodspeed's an American translation. Anybody here seen Goodspeed's American translation? No. There's a reason for that. It's called the Revised Standard Version. Back in 1870, scholars in England had begun to work on the first major revision of the King James Bible, motivated largely because of all these new manuscripts that had been discovered. And as I mentioned, Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus had been made available, and scholars like these guys, B.F. Westcott and F.G.A. Hort, had created a new critical edition of the New Testament, which was published in 1881. It took them 28 years. But in the years leading up to 1881, they shared advanced copies with translators in England who were trying to create a new version of the King James, which eventually was called the English Revised Version. And this British Translation Committee had enlisted the participation of American scholars. They generated a list of corrections and emendations to make the text more accessible to American audiences, sent them to the British translators, who promptly ignored every one of them, and then printed the list as an appendix, sort of, this is what our American cousins think. And that was, I think, offensive to the Americans. And so they started their own translation revision process to create what became known as the American Standard Version, published in 1901. It was based on the Revised Version of 1881, but incorporated those American changes as well as some other things, including more euphemism. We're going to talk about euphemism. For example, they found euphemisms for words like bowels. Decided in modern English this was too much. Neither the Revised Version of 1881 or the American Standard Version of 1901 were, in hindsight, good translations. They were now in the modern period of text critical study. They recognized the need for modern language, so that's good. But they were not bold enough in their engagement with the modern language to create something that was new or interesting or unique or really innovative. These new revisions were too close to the King James to be interesting to those who wanted change, but too different to be acceptable to people who preferred the old text. It would take another 2 generations and 2 world wars before society had changed enough for a truly new revision to happen. That project in time was the Revised Standard Version, published in 1946. Not quite there yet. Published in 1946 in the New Testament and in the whole Bible in 1952. Does anyone here remember the publication of the Revised Standard Version in 1952? A couple people. It was huge. They printed the New Testament in the pages of the Chicago Tribune. They delivered a copy to the President of the United States. It was a cultural event. Now, the RSV Bible ushered in a totally new era of Bible translation. Does it surprise you that this coincided with post-World War II 1950s America? No, the fact is things were changing, had changed. Paradigms for what the Bible was and how it should be used were changing along with everything else. Also, does it surprise you that the publication of it in 1952 was controversial? Conservatives, who were not at all happy with cultural changes taking place, were also not at all happy with the RSV. They made all kinds of charges against the version, against the underlying Greek text, against the ideological commitments and sexual proclivities of the translators. In decades to follow, some conservatives would continue to double down on the KJV, but a greater share turned to new translation projects which could provide a modern language update, but within a conservative theological paradigm. So this led to the mushrooming of Bible versions such as the Living Bible, the New American Standard Version, the New International Version, the Holman Christian Standard Bible, the English Standard Version, the Voice, the Message, the Modern English Version, the Contemporary English Version, today's English Version, the Common English Bible, and so on. So let me offer then, by way of conclusion, a few words very quickly about theology. As we've seen, the Bible translation is always embedded in and is an expression of theological, political, social conflict. Like all theological expression, indeed all truth claims. So we can't discuss any theological claim without rooting our analysis in the historical context of that claim. Who made it? When and where? Why? And for whom? The same must be said of Bible translation. No translation exists purely as a linguistic or theological choice. Each act of translation must be discussed within its historical context. Who made it? When and where? Why? And for whom? So what does this mean for the church? Despite what some people may claim, we cannot simply appeal to the Bible to judge and resolve theological conflicts. The Bible is already part of these conflicts. In translation, it has been created as an expression of particular positions in these debates. Because of this embedded political nature of all Bible reading, when we use the Bible in these issues, we, us, literally, must show careful discernment. We must be critical in our judgments. We must, I think, show compassionate sensitivity to the community and how our reading of the Bible might impact the community. The RSV controversy in the 1950s and the many debates about the Bible translation that it unleashed will be the focus of our next 2 lectures. Here are a few little tidbits. There's versions of them. Removed. In the 5th lecture, we're going to take a look at the ground of the battlefield now after decades of war and ask ourselves, where are we? What remains? What has passed away? What will be the new directions in translation? But I hope that these first 2 lectures have shown that none of these modern debates can be understood apart from the complex history of the biblical text itself and of the English Bible in the midst of political, social, theological conflict of the Reformation. It's a story worth telling because it's a story that we're still living. Thank you so much.